Good afternoon. I am Virginia Brissett, the President and CEO of the Jewish Council located in Gainesville, the heart of North Central Florida. It is my pleasure to represent the Southern Alliance for Jewish Education and welcoming you to From Sephard to Savannah and Beyond, Southern Jewish Cooking and Culture with Sara Gardner. The Southern Alliance for Jewish Education, or SAJE as we call it, is an informal collective of Jewish congregations and other organizations who network to share program ideas and opportunities. This Jewish Culture and Cooking series is the third webinar that we have hosted together as a group in 2021. Today, we're going down to the Delta to learn about the Ashkenazi roots in that area of the United States. We are absolutely over the top cavelling that so many of you have chosen to spend your afternoons with us. This past week, our registration jumped from 160 to 270, thanks to a post by My Jewish Learning that included us in their weekly email of activities. So here's a big shout out to My Jewish Learning, who has been my go-to for Jewish education for so many years.
On my ride on the...
Thank you. We are so honored that you featured us. We hope that you were able to tune into all of the sessions in this series, but don't worry if you can't be with us for all of them. We are recording them and we'll make the link available to you after. After the series concludes, we will upload all of the sessions to YouTube. If you appreciate this learning opportunity organized by SAJE, please consider making a donation to any of the sponsoring organizations who made today possible. They are the Jewish Council in Gainesville, Florida, Temple Bethel and Temple Emmanuel in Birmingham, Alabama, Temple Israel in Brookline, Massachusetts, Temple of Israel in Wilmington, North Carolina, and the Tomaso family of Augusta, Georgia. I would also like to take a moment to thank the steering committee of SAJE, and in particular, Sue Tomaso, who's hating me right now. She brings us so many great, fabulous ideas and then gently nudges us all along to make them happen. I want to thank Rabbi, who is a fabulous host. And last but certainly not least, we'll thank Sara, who is an incredibly knowledgeable scholar and is incredibly delightful to work with in planning this class. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Emily Losman-Ostrov of the Temple of Israel to introduce you to our speaker. Thank you.
Shalom, everyone. It is wonderful to be with you all this afternoon, to meet new friends and be with old friends. And as those of you heard me say from the beginning, to see that we are spanning from the East Coast to the West Coast, everywhere in between Canada and England, it is great to have everyone with us. If you haven't already, I invite you to put your name and where you're from in the chat so that we can connect with everyone. And speaking of the chat function is open throughout the program, so feel free to comment as Sara will present to us. Feel free to, share a story in there, or you can also privately chat with everyone. Hopefully by now, I'm still working on y'all. I may live in Wilmington, North Carolina, but I'm a Philly girl, so y'all will come eventually. But I hope y'all are familiar with Zoom. If you have any questions, feel free to private message me or Virginia if we can help you. And we will be spotlighting Sara, and also her magic hands will be spotlit as well. But if you're on a computer, you can toggle between the spotlight, the speaker view, or the gallery view. It's right up there in your top right corner. We're also going to ask everyone to please remain on mute unless you're going to ask a question. And of course, we welcome those questions as well. And let me go ahead, and because we are a Jewish program and I'm a rabbi, I'd like to start us off with a blessing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And again, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you'll see how we do this. And what I've learned as a rabbi over this last 19 months or so is that the best way to do a Zoom blessing and get it to kind of sound like we're all saying it together is to repeat a few words at a time. So can everybody see my blessing? Do you see the whole prayer up? Okay, great. And now is an opportunity. I'm inviting you, if you would like to unmute, if you'd like to go along and say this prayer with me, whether you're Jewish or not, feel free. And otherwise just say amen at the end. So we join together, Baruch Atah Adonai. Eloheinu melech haolam.
Eloheinu melech haolam.
Asher
Asher
Kishanu
Kishanu
B'Mitzvotav.
B'Mitzvotav.
Asher
V'Tivanu La'asot
Mitzvotav Divrei Torah.
Divrei
Divrei Torah.
What a wonderful
Amen.
cacophony. I love it. And the English translation, feel free to say amen at the end. Blessed are you,
Blessed are you, Adonai, our
sovereign
God,
of the universe,
sovereign of the universe,
who
who hallows us with
mitzvot,
mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
What wonderful enthusiasm. I want to thank you all for joining in this prayer. As I said last week, you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't this a program on food? What does that have to do with Torah? Well, if you know anything about Judaism, you know that Jews and food, we go hand in hand, but we will learn a little bit of Torah as well from Sara. And just being together is truly a blessing and a sense of celebration of Torah in and of itself. And speaking of Sara, let me go ahead and praise her and share just a little bit of her incredible background so that we're all ready to learn from our new friend. So Sara Gardner, and you know what, Sara, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you so everyone can see your Shana Punam as well. There we go. Sara is a second-year PhD student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies at the University of Minnesota. Her work focuses on the culinary heritage and cultural identity of the Sephardic Jews. Before coming to the University of Minnesota, she worked as the collaborations manager for the Jewish Arts Collaborative and the associate director for young adult programs at Hebrew College in Boston, Massachusetts. She is an alumna of Tufts University, and from 2016 to 2017, Sara lived and researched medieval Sephardic culinary heritage in Spain as a Fulbright graduate research scholar. She has presented her work at various international food studies conferences, including the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery and the Dublin Gastronomy Symposium. Sara is also a published cookbook author, and you can buy her cookbook, the Rosh Hashanah Seder Cookbook, Stories and Recipes from the Reformed Jewish Community of Madrid, on Amazon. And we will go ahead and we'll put that link in there. And as Sara told us very proudly last week, that the profits from buying that book go to help that community. So very exciting. I am going to symbolically step away. By that, I'm going to just unspotlight myself, and I'm going to also spotlight your hands, Sara. And with that, take it away.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rabbi, for such a warm welcome. I'm thrilled to be back for a second week with you all. Another huge thank you to SAJE for bringing me here. It's been such a fun process to work with you all, and it's so cool to see it come to fruition together. It's really, I'm just amazed. And of course, another shout out to My Jewish Learning, one of my favorite sources for Jewish knowledge, and I am delighted to see you all here. Like, whether you came through My Jewish Learning, SAJE, or some other corner of the internet, I'm delighted you're here. So we had a really wonderful first class dedicated to the Sephardic heritage of Savannah, Georgia, and exploring that heritage through food. And today we're going to be focusing on the Ashkenazi heritage of the Delta region of the South. And unlike last time, actually today we're going to start with the cooking. So I'm just going to give a quick little introduction, and then we're going to go to cook. And then I'll be filling you in on the history kind of behind the food, why I selected the particular recipe I selected. But today we are going to be making a peach and pecan noodle kugel, which I think is like this really absolutely outrageous and delicious sort of fusion of Ashkenazi and Southern traditions. And so I'm very excited to show that to you and kind of then unpack exactly why I chose this and kind of what we can learn from it. So I'm going to take you all over with me to my cooking station. You can see me here. You can see my hands. Give me a thumbs up if you can see my hands. Okay, cool. And I'm going to put you up here so that, and again, as with last time, there's a lot of interesting cinematography we got to work with here. So I appreciate your patience and understanding if the view is not great. Please feel free to chime in. It seems that my camera has turned off. Okay, here we are.
Please mute everybody.
Okay, great. So great. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can. Okay, excellent, great. So we're gonna start, noodle kugel is something that's, it was one of, I keep unmuting, I keep being muted. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so noodle kugel is one of those foods that is very familiar. It's like sort of one of our most iconic Jewish foods, right? Like Ashkenazi soul food at its greatest. And yes, Carol, my cooking gear has arrived. So we're working with a much better setup today. A huge shout out to everyone from the first class who went on that very interesting cooking journey with me. So as many, Ashkenazi Jews I grew up with noodle kugel. It's one of my favorites. And it's this sort of summation, I think, of the often poor heritage mixed with the American bounty that a lot of Ashkenazi immigrants found when they came to the United States, where we have this thing that's very kind of basic. It's just noodles mixed with some dairy and some eggs and cooked, but it's a lot of noodles and a lot of dairy. And I think it's a really kind of symbolic food of the American Ashkenazi experience. So we're gonna start off here. I don't know if you can quite see it, I'm just gonna turn you for a second, but right here I've got a pot of water boiling on the stove, and I'm gonna add 16 ounces of egg noodles. You can use Manischewitz brand. The brand doesn't really matter. You just want the wide ones. Here you can see they're the wider cut egg noodles. My supermarket had only thin ones from the Manischewitz brand. And so actually before I put that in, I haven't salted this water. I'm gonna actually add some salt to this water because this is gonna be a really sweet kugel. And it's really important, just as like a general rule of thumb. And this is not so much a Jewish innovation as, someone who likes to cook kind of innovation, that salt is a really great thing that brings out the sweetness. Often you'll find with historical recipes that there's less salt in things because it was a commodity that only the very wealthy could afford. So our modern use of salt is much greater than in historical recipes. So I'm gonna add in a little modern innovation here. I don't believe it's in your recipe sheet, so feel free to mark it, and I can edit it to include that later. But so I'm gonna add my noodles in here. And again, about 16 ounces. So that's about right. Okay, great. So here we are. I'm gonna give that a nice stir. And I'm gonna boil these until they are soft and pliable. So about 7 to 10 minutes. It depends on the package. It depends on the brand of noodle you're using, but just follow the package directions. And in the meantime, what we're gonna do, so the amazing thing about this kugel is sort of like a fusion between a pecan pie and a noodle kugel. Two very, very sweet things. Again, so that's why salt here is again, our friend and really important, because it helps us kind of also differentiate between the various types of sweet that are happening here. We have brown sugar, we have like actual just regular sugar being added, and then we also have peaches. So we're gonna add sweetness through fruit, right? So there are different kind of layers of sweetness. And again, having that nice salt contrast allows us to taste what different sweetnesses are happening. But the wonderful thing about this recipe is it also is kind of a showstopper. So we will be doing that in a similar way as we would, I don't know if there are any pecan pie makers and lovers out there, but we're kind of going to do a similar thing. Okay, I see Judy and Tamika. Okay, right on. We're going to be doing a similar thing here with our kugel. But first, we're going to start off. I've just got a stick of butter in a glass 13 by 9 inch pan. My oven is preheated to 350 degrees. So I'm gonna actually just use the heat as I get all my other ingredients ready to go. And now I want to say, like, you can use a 13 by 9 inch pan, which is the pan for this recipe, but you can also get a little creative with your pan choice. I've seen this made in beautiful like rings, like bundt rings. It's kind of your pecan kugel journey. So if you really want to make it beautiful, yeah, pecan or pecan, I'm not sure where my accent places me geographically in the United States, but I'm saying pecan because it feels right if we're talking about Southern Jewish food. So again, you can use different types of pans. You can use like a 9-inch round pan, just flat. You could use another sort of ovular Pyrex if you wanted a glass dish. It doesn't have to be a glass dish. Or I've seen it in really nice rings in one of those springform pans where you can take the bottom out and then you have this beautiful ring of pecan peach kugel. Okay, so to that, we're gonna prep this for when our butter comes out of the oven. I'm just gonna press here. I've got a cup measure and I'm putting in a cup of brown sugar. And so here's the cool thing I think about brown sugar, and particularly dark brown sugar, which is the sort of more underrated brown sugar. Most people opt for light brown sugar. Different types of brown sugar give you different qualities in the thing you're making. So if you want something really kind of rich and actually weirdly slightly less sweet because there's more molasses added to that dark brown sugar than in a light brown sugar, that's how they get the brown color. First of all, I like dark brown sugar for that complexity. It gives us a complex note. So it's not just a one note sweetness. We're not just dealing with like, oh my God, very sweet kind of flavor, which if you like, you can opt to use light brown sugar here. But also dark brown sugar, because it has actually like a slightly higher moisture content for baked goods, less so for this recipe, but just a fun note for folks who bake a lot. It will give you sort of a denser, moisture texture in a cake. So I love having dark brown sugar in my pantry, and I highly recommend that you have both. And in recipes where it asks for like a light brown sugar, you can easily, and I recommend that you do, I think it's my personal preference, you can pick your own, but try substituting a dark brown sugar. It will add a kind of layer of flavor that I think is very nice. So we've got our cup of brown sugar, and then also ready I have about 2 cups of pecan halves, and they're whole, right? They're unbroken, whole pecan halves, which we're gonna array. And I also have some canned peaches that I've pre-drained. So here, this is a note if you're using fresh peaches, because I also included fresh peaches in this recipe. If you're using fresh peaches here, and they have the skin on, you can actually use the boiling water that your pasta is boiling in about a minute before you take it out to blanch the peaches. So I'm just gonna kind of talk you through that. I'm sorry, I couldn't find fresh peaches in my market. Maybe you can still in October down in the South. But in Minneapolis, we're far beyond peach season. So what you would do is you would take the peach, you would score a small X in the bottom of the peach, just enough to kind of create a slit in the skin. And then in the last minute before you drain your pasta, you're gonna pop those peaches into this boiling water for about 30 seconds. And then have a bowl of ice water on the side. And before you dump the water out, you're gonna put the peaches in that ice water, and then they'll be really easy to peel and you can slice them and make nice slices. That's if you wanna go through that effort. That's if you have really lovely fresh peaches at your availability. I don't, again, so I'm just using some nice canned sliced peaches. I use peaches in these peaches are also going to add some extra, oops, there goes a peach. Flinging peaches over here. These peaches are also going to add extra moisture. So you want to make sure they're really well drained. So I've been draining these peaches for about 30 minutes already. And I recommend that you do that so you can kind of control the amount of moisture that's going into your kugel. Okay, with that, I'm going to grab my butter. Yeah.
So we had a couple questions come in. So one question was, how do you soften the brown sugar?
How do you soften it? Okay, so here's a trick for softening brown sugar. First of all, to prevent it from hardening in the first place, store it in a jar that has a really tight lid. So that can be a mason jar. That can be one of those plastic bins that you can get at like TJ Maxx or Home Goods that lock. The thing that dries brown sugar out is air. And if you prevent air from getting in, usually what I do when I buy brown sugar in bags like this is I will empty the contents into a container large enough that can air seal. And then that way you can avoid like the sugar hardening, right? Because as that moisture meets the air dries it out. A trick, if you have like a rock hard chunk of sugar in your cabinet, which we have all had before, is you can actually put it in the microwave. You put it in a bowl, a microwave safe bowl, lightly moisten a towel, like a tea towel, and lay it over the top of that bowl, and then stick it in your microwave and microwave it for 30-second increments. You don't want to microwave it for too long, right? Because you'll melt your sugar, and then that's a little bit difficult. But that's how I've kind of saved really hard brown sugar in a pinch. You can just kind of set that bowl up, a lightly moistened tea towel over the top, microwaved in 30-second increments. Were there any other questions, Rabbi?
I think they got answered. The questions were how much peaches, 2 cups of peaches, and
Yeah.
Judy someone recommended putting a slice of apple in the container with the brown sugar, or putting an apple core in the bag the day before. So these are some tricks of the trade that are coming in through the chat. Is that right?
I love that. I love that. Also, you can buy clay brown sugar keepers as well. Stick it in your container. But again, the best, right, like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The best thing you can do, I think, is immediately put your brown sugar in a container that has a seal that keeps the air out. Cool. So thank you for those great questions. I appreciate it. Okay. So I'm going to just check my noodles here. And I'm a taster. I like to taste my noodles and make sure they're soft. In this case, we don't want them to even be al dente. We do want them to be soft. So the normal way you would cook pasta, right? You leave it a little kind of chewy. This needs about 2 more minutes to be fully soft because we're not trying to bite into something crunchy. If you are the type of person who likes a crunchy kugel, though, there are kind of a couple of different things you can do with this recipe to do that. You can cook your noodles for about half the time of this recipe, and that way you can get like a nice kind of crunch because it will continue to cook in the oven. It will be a crunchier and a little bit of a lighter kugel. It won't be as dense because what this pre-cooking does is it allows that starch to kind of form already, and that starch in the noodle is the thing that gives you that really nice kind of thick, squidgy texture, right? When you make a casserole with those noodles. So you can do that. I've also made kugels where you don't cook the noodles at all. I wouldn't quite recommend it with this particular recipe, but everyone's welcome to give it a try and let me know how it goes. Okay, so I'm gonna grab my butter, which is hopefully, all fully melted by now, which is great. So, and this is just like a sort of clever way to make sure that the butter melts. And it's also a good use of the residual heat of your oven, right? Because like if we're talking about Ashkenazi food, I think historically, like one of the lessons we learned from the Ashkenazi culinary repertoire is it's a food that tries as much as possible to prevent waste. And we see that in other Jewish traditions as well. I'm going to say a shout out here to my friend Susan Barocas, who is here and has attended many Hazon Jewish food conferences with me, where we've talked a lot about, you know, in our Jewish tradition, there are a lot of ways to prevent waste. And one of the ways that we can prevent waste here is by using the residual heat of our oven, right? We're using resources. We're also this is a great recipe as well. If you don't have peaches and you don't want to use peaches, I'm using peaches today, of course, because they relate to the area of the South where we're talking about, but you can really use any other type of fruit here. Like I think an apple would be great here. I have some plums in my fridge, like they would be a great substitute. So also, if you're avoiding food waste or if you just don't like peaches, like there are a lot of substitutions that can happen here. And, you know, I think there's a lot of flexibility. And one of my favorite kind of aspects of the Jewish culinary repertoire is how frugal it is and how it makes use of sort of all of the different aspects of food that we have in front of us. And I think that's a really powerful lesson, especially given our current you know, environmental challenges and climate change, right? So, okay, so I'll get off my soapbox with that. And I'm gonna add this cup of brown sugar just right in here. And I'm just gonna kind of mush it in. And I want it to fully absorb into this butter. If you want to make a parve version of this, you could also do this with, I don't know if you know that Earth Balance brand. It's a very good margarine. It's a vegan spread. It is very, very good. Also, if you have vegans in your life, that's a great substitute for this. And you could, you know, include different, you know, dairy substitutes as well and make this kind of parve. So I'm just really mixing this in because right, when we're dealing with butter is this really interesting thing where it has a lot of water, a lot of fat, and it has protein, right? And they all kind of coalesce, they coagulate, right? They become solid at different temperatures. And so we are kind of working with that. We kind of see that extra liquid of that butter coming out here. So we just want to really get that well integrated into our sugar. And then at the end of this, oops, a little butter over the edge. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of spread this mixture out nicely all over the bottom of my pan. And so if you're using a pan that is not this shape, you're going to do exactly the same thing. You're just going to do it in the shape of the pan that you're using. So if you're using a bundt pan, you're just going to simply kind of spread this out right over that you know, circular pan bottom. And then once that's set, I'm just going to pause. I'm going to drain my noodles really quickly. And time is of the essence here with these noodles. We're going to keep them covered because we don't want them to dry out too much, right? We want that kind of nice squidgy texture. And if these noodles dry out, we're not going to get that nice squidgy texture of our kugel. So I'm going to drain them and then I'm going to put them back in the strainer in the pot that I use. I'll show this to you after I do it. And then I'm going to put the cover of the pot over it. And so again, it's a great way to save dishes. It's also a great way, like say if we're thinking in the mindset of, you know, a person from the 18th, 19th century, we didn't have a lot of equipment, right? So we're kind of using the equipment in many, many ways. Okay, so I'm going to drain this really quick. And Rabbi, as I'm doing this, are there any questions in the chat?
The only question, let's see, I think one or two people may be having a little bit of an issue seeing your hands. We want to make sure we can see, but I think we're okay. But let's see if we need to ask you to tilt. I just put in the chat the definition of parve, just in case anyone was unfamiliar with that word. And let's see how we're doing. Any other questions or comments? Everyone feel free to write in the chat. And I think we're just waiting. We can't wait to see what you're gonna do with that big pot.
Awesome. So I'm just showing you my setup. I think like one of the things that is great to learn, you know, when you're watching someone cook is also how, you know, how they kind of navigate the space and with their tools. So, okay, here I am. This is the setup I just explained to you of there's a pot, it's got a strainer in it, and I'm using the top of my pot to keep these noodles nice and soft. Okay, so they're just gonna chill there while we do like a really beautiful arrangement now.
Okay, Sarah,
let me people are having trouble.
Okay, this may be like antithetical to the South, but somebody did want to know if you can use walnuts instead of pecans. I don't know if that's allowed. That might be.
Look, you know, it's a great question, and I will always be the person to tell you it is your party. You can do whatever you want. Okay, so if you want to use walnuts, use walnuts. And walnuts are actually not antithetical to the South. They are also produced in the South. So pecans, walnuts are great. If you really want to take this recipe even in a more untraditional direction, like feel free to substitute any other nut. So we're doing a technique here where we're actually kind of making a sort of not fully solid brittle at the top of our kugel. And that is something, you know, I don't know if anybody who likes peanut brittle, like you'd be very Southern, do a peanut arrangement at the top of this, and I think that would be delicious. But basically what we're doing is this butter and this sugar kind of solidifies. We're going to lay out, just right now, I'm going to lay out these pecans in like a nice arrangement and some peaches. And what's going to happen is, right, it's on the bottom of our pan as our kugel, which is essentially like a custard casserole, right, with the eggs and the dairy we're putting in that mixture. As that solidifies, right, because the baking process solidifies it. It brings really what it's doing when you're cooking a kugel is it's a mixture of noodles suspended in a custard, right? It's eggs mixed with dairy, and eggs solidify at certain temperatures, right? And that gives us the structure of the kugel. So as that's happening in the oven, what's also happening is that bottom sort of what is now a slightly solid brittle becomes liquid. And so when we pull this out of the oven and we plate it, we're going to flip it upside down. And then you have this like lovely kind of like caramel moment happening on top of it, right? So you can really do that with any nut that you want. It's not, you know, on the theme of this class necessarily, but hey, I will always encourage you to try it out, experiment, and then send me an email and tell me if it was good, okay? So walnuts are totally cool. Right now, what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna use my pecans, and you can do this in any array you want. If you're doing circles, you can do concentric circles in a pan. I'm just kind of I'm gonna alternate these pecans with peaches, and we'll get like a nice design that way. But the key thing here is, so maybe you can see. So here's the top of our pecan, right? That's the round side. And then here's the flat side of our pecan, right? And I'm putting this flat side up because the part of the pecan that I want to show, right? We have to kind of think the opposite because we're gonna be flipping this. The part of the pecan that I want up is, oops, as I drop it, this top part, right? This round part. So I'm just gonna stick these in to this caramel that I've sort of created, and they're slightly overlapping. So I'm gonna just show you a little closer. The pan is a little hot, so I can't pick it up, but just kind of what it looks like in the pan is, you see how these nuts are just slightly overlapping and just kind of giving each other a light hug. That's what we want, and that's how we're gonna line our pan. So you can, again, this is like a fun opportunity to like flex your culinary creativity. This is your journey. You can use different nuts, you can use different fruits. I think honestly, something like an apricot and an almond one would be something I think would be delicious because I love that combination. And what's wonderful about the noodle kugel is just kind of generally sweet, right? It doesn't have like a strong flavor one way or the other. So it's really like a wonderful blank canvas for many, many different flavors and many, many different spices. We're using cinnamon here today and vanilla, but you could throw in, you know, if you wanted a sort of more Middle Eastern vibe, like some cardamom, some nutmeg, ginger, like spice it up. Through in a nice way. So I'm just here laying these out. And also a tip for your peaches, if you're using canned peaches, right? Again, they are going to add a lot of moisture, and that's going to affect how, here, let me bring you down so maybe you can see a little bit better. Bring you right in close. Is that better? There you go. So here I am, I'm just laying these pecans out. But as I was saying, so the liquid, that excess liquid from our peaches, it can affect the formulation of this caramel that's happening here. Because more liquid means more time that it takes for that caramel to become solid. Because what's gonna happen is it's gonna be really liquid when it comes out of the oven because it's really hot. But eventually what happens is as this kugel cools, it kind of coalesces again, and you have that like sort of pecan pie filling texture at the top of your kugel, right? So again, because we're adding a little extra moisture from these peaches, we want to make sure they're nice and dry, that they've been draining. I drained mine for 30 minutes, but in a pinch, if you don't have 30 minutes, lay out your peach slices individually on a paper towel and pat them dry with another paper towel.
Sarah, I'm going to just stop spotlighting your beautiful face for 1 second. I think some people are having trouble seeing it in gallery view, so I want to make sure they can see your hands.
Definitely.
And also I've got some other interesting things coming in the chat. So let's see, we also, Abby is talking about putting sugar in the bottom of the casserole and putting the hot noodles on top to form the syrup and keep the noodles soft. Then she adds Fleischmann's parve margarine and melts into the mix. She adds apple pieces and golden raisins, then the eggs when the mix has cooled, and tops it with cinnamon and sugar.
Wow, lovely. Yeah, totally. I love that. And like, there are many ways, thank you, Robert, for highlighting that. Like, there are many ways of doing this. This is just one way, but the same sort of basic principle applies. So now I'm just gonna put my peaches down. You could also do this. I think it would be really show-stopping actually to do this with peach halves instead, and you put the cut side down of those halves. And then when you flip it, you have this like amazing view of the inside of these peaches. So that like this is, you know, this recipe is just illustrating what we're talking about in this class, but by no means is it the only way of doing things. And, you know, I heartily encourage you all to like experiment and find your own way of doing it, because this is about your culinary journey. I'm just here to show you some tips and tricks and some neat things that you can do. So, okay, so I'm just gonna lay out my peaches one more time, and then I've got one last row. And again, this is your journey. You don't have to lay out your peaches this way. I think it'll look nice this way, but it's what you want to do. Okay. So, okay. Give it 2 more. And I only use, again, because we have so much sweetness happening here, I'm only using peaches that were in juice. Okay, not in light syrup or syrup. It will be so sweet, I think. So I opted for juice. You can do light syrup or syrup if you like, but just a warning, it will be really sweet. Another thing you can do to kind of counter that sweetness is you could actually here add a pinch of salt. If I were serving this for company, for example, I would add salt at the end. So I would flip this out, as we're going to do at the end of this class. And then I would just give it a nice sprinkle of salt. Okay, but so here we got our nice layout here. And now I'm actually going to move it to the side because we're going to work on our actual casserole, which is just a super nice, super easy kind of dump and mix recipe. I like calling recipes dump and mix, the ones that you just kind of mix everything together. So what we're going to do, I'm going to apply this food here. First, we're gonna make our base. So I've got a cup of sour cream in here. Actually, 2 cups. This is a pound of sour cream, and I'm going full fat. I'm a full fat lady, and I highly recommend it. For this recipe, I would not use any sort of lower fat content dairy because I just don't think it will taste as good. But if you want to do that, if that's important to you in your diet, you are of course welcome to. This is just my personal preference as the person who will be eating this kugel at the end of this. So I'm going to put my sour cream in here. Great. And then I also have full fat cottage cheese. Right, and this is dairy heavy, so you'll have to, take a nap after this. Okay, so here's our cup. And in some grocery stores, I wasn't actually able to find it, but you can sometimes find, I'm gonna actually move this so you can see this better. There you are. In some grocery stores, you can find full fat cottage cheese with a cream top. If you really want to go the full fat experience, that is delicious. And I think here would be really wonderful and decadent. Okay. Oh, I forgot my sugar. I need my sugar. Okay. Can't forget our other type of sugar. We're using granulated sugar here as well. So I'm going to throw in first 4 eggs. I'm just going to break those in.
So Sarah, as you're breaking the eggs, 2 things coming in from the chat. One is exactly how much sour cream and how much cottage cheese. I know it's in the recipe, but can you repeat that?
A cup and a cup. So we got
a cup and a cup.
Yeah.
The other thing somebody said, go with the full fat, but do half the slice, or smaller piece. So
exactly. Yeah, good advice.
And then some people, Janet mentions the cream thing must be a Minnesota dairy farm thing. Never seen it in the Northeast. I've never seen it or heard of it, but it sounds interesting.
Oh, I've seen it. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, well, worth it to check it out. Ask your grocer. See. Okay, so great.
Would you use farmer's cheese, the little packages of farmer's cheese instead of cottage cheese?
You can use farmer's cheese. The only thing is that farmer's cheese is also like a lower fat content. And Ina, I see you asking how many eggs. This is 4 eggs. There are 4 eggs in here. If you would use farmer cheese, then I would say make sure you're using full fat sour cream. Or instead of farmer cheese, I would actually use a full fat ricotta if you want something that has a smaller curd, because it gives, what this is doing is making like a really rich and creamy custard that the noodles will cook in. And that's the structure of the kugel, but this is also like a base to add a lot of flavor. Like we're gonna add our cinnamon and our vanilla in here as well. And you can use different types of dairy. I by no means want to, say that you only have to use, oh, it does on the recipe say 16 ounces. It is 16 ounces. I'm sorry. It's not just 1 cup. I used a full 16 ounces. Thank you for catching that. But again, you really want a fat content here. The fat's really important because what does fat do in a recipe? It adds flavor, right? It makes things smooth. It helps things coalesce. Yeah, Tamiko, I see you. It also gives us texture. It's really important for the textural configuration of the casserole or really anything. That's why every recipe, every really kind of addictive recipe that you eat, it has a good amount of fat in it, fat and sugar and salt, right? Which is what we're doing here as well. Okay, so again, you can use farmer cheese, but because just kind of think about the amount of fat you're introducing here. And if you're using farmer cheese, add something that has like a little more fat in it as its, you know, component, its complement. I mean, don't use, say, farmer cheese, full fat Greek yogurt, because the fat content, again, won't be enough. In my opinion, right? You can make it and prove me wrong as well. I'm not trying to be a fat dictator about which dairies to use and not. Okay, so we're gonna put in 2/3 of a cup of sugar.
Sarah, if you'll permit me, there's some questions about the recipe, and everyone hopefully got the recipe when you got your Zoom confirmation.
Yeah.
It was in the link in the Dropbox, but I'm gonna go ahead and try to put the PDF also here in the chat, so you'll have it there as well.
Yes, great. Okay. Yeah, you should be reading the same recipe that I'm reading here as well. Okay, and so sorry about the quantity mix-up. Sometimes when I'm speaking, I don't say the right quantity, so thank you for catching it. But yes, to confirm, it's 16 ounces. It's just the average container of cottage cheese that you can pick up at the store. Okay, so we've got our 4 eggs, we've got our sugar, we've got our cinnamon. That's all going in here. Again, you can follow the recipe to the T here and put in a teaspoon of cinnamon. You can also put in more cinnamon. Like, it doesn't, you know, it's your journey. I'm going to put in a teaspoon, and I'm going to show you this trick that I really love. Everybody in the little cup of their hand right here has about half a teaspoon. And I like to do it just because I also like to feel what I'm putting in my recipes, but just in case you don't have the spoon at the ready, you can throw in you can approximate the measurement. So there's our teaspoon of cinnamon, and then there's a half a teaspoon of vanilla. I'm gonna add a little more just because I don't have my teaspoon right here with me, and I like the flavor of it. Again, this is a great place to add cardamom. You could add ginger, you could add the nutmeg, you could add all types of things. So you wanted to take it in a really different direction and say you were doing that almond and apricot thing on the top. You could add almond extract instead of vanilla extract. It's not sort of traditional to the recipe we're making, but I want to offer these as suggestions of how you can, you know, make this recipe your own as well. Okay, so here's this nice custard that we've made, right? It's a nice consistency. That's our liquid. That's really important. Okay, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything since I misquoted you. Okay, cool. All right, another important thing here that we have to do is I've got another stick of butter. We love our stick of butter. And I'm gonna take our noodles here. Oops, I'm gonna move this over to the side here. Sorry for the bad cinematography, if this is giving anyone motion sickness. Okay, so we've drained our noodles nicely. I'm actually just gonna pour them back into this pot. And again, this is just another way of introducing fat. We're layering sugar here, but we're also layering fat. And what does that do? It gives the thing we're making different qualities, different textures, and different richness, okay? So we're gonna take this stick of butter in these noodles that are still hot. And I'm just gonna cut this in. And I'm just gonna stir our noodles and coat them in this butter.
While you're doing that, I have a question. Does it make any difference in a recipe in general if you beat eggs or lightly beat eggs before you add them to other ingredients, or if you add them whole?
It doesn't make To be quite honest, it doesn't make a huge difference, but what it will do is give you, you know, more control over, like, sometimes eggs, membranes separate if they're older eggs and they're sort of solid. It can allow you to see that before you actually add it to your bowl, and you can kind of remove those more solid membranes and then, you know, add them to your mixture. But in terms of like any sort of significant like flavor or structural difference, it will not make a difference if you just put your eggs in whole or if you pre-beat them.
Okay, thank you. I always mix them in a separate bowl because I don't want shell or other things to get in.
I almost had a heart attack when she did that, just so you know. I could picture my mother, you know, saying you have to crack the egg into a separate container before you put it into your mix. So I can see some of you have the same kind of.
Right. And look, I mean, it's also like, right, we're dealing with like Jewish culinary traditions. It's also a good way to make sure if there are blood spots in your eggs. Generally, I will be totally honest with you, I do not keep kosher, so it is not a practice that I have in my culinary repertoire. But if you do, I encourage you to add that as a step. You do not, again, this recipe is for your enjoyment and for your fun. You do not have to follow exactly what I'm doing. I think it's really helpful just as like kind of a theoretical framing for what this class is and how we're teaching this recipe. It's really helpful to see different ways that people cook so that you can kind of pick and choose and learn techniques that maybe you don't usually see. And of course, you can always choose to take them on or not. So I invite you to take what you think is great that I'm doing and leave all of the stuff that you don't think is great that I'm doing, okay? And so again, to folks, if you have a practice of cracking eggs in a bowl, please feel free to do that. But if anybody says to you that it will make a strong difference in the flavor or the structure of your baked good, I'm not sure how true that is.
Yeah,
but
that's really all I wondered about.
Oh, sorry, what was that, Heath?
Just that was what I was wondering about. It structurally, it made a difference.
No, not at all.
Yeah. Thanks.
And I'm thinking of the Jewish superstition as well. So you gotta, there's every part that plays into it. Sarah, I want you to know there's been some interesting comments about how to make things either parve or non-dairy in general. That's coming up in the chat as well. Wanting to know if there's a substitute for the cottage cheese or a substitute for the sour cream.
You know, off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of some good substitutes that could make it parve or vegan. I think, I'm not sure what's available in your vegan or kosher sections, but if there's, you could use like you could use a full fat like coconut yogurt instead of the sour cream. And you could just double it. You don't have to use like cottage cheese, or really you would triple it, right? Because we've got a cup of sour cream and really 2 cups of cottage cheese is what 16 ounces is. So you could do that and make it completely, or any other sort of dairy substitute yogurt. Like I think cashew yogurt is also really wonderful. It's high fat, it's rich. It'll give you that kind of richness that dairy does kind of very naturally. That can be hard to replicate in other parve or vegan recipes. So I've never seen a vegan cottage cheese substitute, but if you have, I recommend you give it a try. Let me know how it goes. And that could be a great substitute as well. Okay, so I'm just gonna pause this here because I wanna make sure this can get into the oven so you can see the finished product before the end of this class. So we've got, I'm gonna turn us back here. So we've melted our butter all over our noodles, which is great. It adds that, again, another layer of fat, another layer of flavor, another kind of structural element here. We've got our like really nice custard that we made. And then we're just gonna take these noodles and we're just gonna put them right, dump them right in. And we're just gonna cover them in this mixture. We are also going to add, I took the remainder of my peaches while we were talking and I just kind of cut them into nice little bite-sized chunks. Here, I'll bring it up so you can hopefully sort of see that. They're just nice chunks. not too big, just, so you get a nice mouthful. You can chop them smaller so they distribute more evenly throughout. You can chop them bigger. You could put full slices. Again, your party. This is just one way of doing it, but give it a try. And then I'm also going to add, the recipe calls for 3/4 of a tablespoon of salt, which for me is like a really nice big pinch. So I'm just gonna add my nice big pinch of salt, okay? And then I'm just gonna cover all of this in our delicious, again, the salt is really important. I'm actually gonna add even just like a little bit more because that's how I like it. You don't have to add more salt, especially if there are folks in the audience watching their salt. You do not have to add salt in all of the places that I'm adding it. You can just subtract it. But it's, for me, I don't like really sweet foods personally. And so the salt helps kind of balance that out if you are similarly savory as I am. Okay, so nice. So now we're gonna bring back our beautiful arrangement of pecans and peaches that we made earlier. Here it is. And so as to not disturb this, we're just gonna really gently at first spoon this mixture over the top. Get a nice, not exactly a spoon, but I'm just placing it because I don't want to disturb that beautiful design I made. Right, because if you just pour this, all of that work will kind of get disturbed. You don't want that. Okay. And like me, you can get your hands in here and make sure it's nice and evenly distributed. Here it is. Seems my pan is a little small for the amount of noodles I got, but that's okay. Just make it work. Just evenly distribute all of this good stuff. And this is also good because, right, you can make sure that like when it comes out, it's gonna be a nice even thickness of this kugel. Cool. So I don't think that I can fit any more in my pan. It's a little bit smaller than I expected. But what I'm going to do, if this happens to you, sometimes that happens, the noodles cook to a bigger volume. I'm just going to pour the remaining sort of liquid in here because that will be really important to let that kugel set. Peach here that I want to make sure it doesn't escape. And I'm just using my hands. You don't have to be as maybe uncouth. I think your hands are your best tools in the kitchen. You could also do this with a spoon. Okay, so I'm gonna wash my hands quickly. And then I'm gonna stick this in my oven. And my oven currently is at 350 degrees. I have a rack placed in the middle of my oven, and that's really important. You want this in the middle of the oven because that's how it will cook evenly. Yeah. Well, look, it's nice and heavy, laden with dairy and noodles. And I'm actually gonna just ask someone, anyone really, if you want to shout out to me in 45 minutes to check the kugel. I want some audience participation. So I know you are all participating, but even more if you want to be my caller outer. Okay, so that's the kugel. One last sort of technical note, and then we're going to move on to the history here. I'm also seeing really fun ideas in the chat. You could make this savory too. You do not have to make a sweet noodle kugel. You could throw some spinach in there, onions, like so delicious. Very fun. I love all of these ideas. and I personally love a savory kugel also, right? Because I don't love sweetness. Another thing you can do, which I did not do, but I have all of these leftover pecans, right? You could chop some up and just throw them into your kugel mix as well. I forgot to do that, but that's also a really fun thing to add some texture because it's a very kind of thick, noodly thing. The one thing I'm going to say about ovens is every oven kind of has its own personality, just like us, its own life. Some ovens run really hot, some ovens run really cold. So just because a recipe says a certain amount of time at a certain temperature, that does not mean that yours will turn out that way. If you are someone who does not like living on the edge and likes the certainty of knowing that, okay, when the recipe says 35 minutes, it's going to be 35 minutes, I highly recommend that you get an oven thermometer, and that will tell you what temperature your oven is actually running at, because electric ovens, gas ovens, they tend to run at very different temperatures. Generally, in my experience, electric ovens run colder and gas ovens run hotter. So that might not be your experience, but that's mine. So again, buy an oven thermometer, but that's why I'm having someone call out at 45 minutes what my kugel is doing and that I should check on it, okay? Another thing that you can do, so this recipe says that you should cook it for an hour. So I'm giving it kind of 15 minutes less to just kind of check on it and make sure. When we check it at 45 minutes, we're also going to kind of give it a turn to make sure that it's evenly cooking all around the kugel, right? Because we don't want some parts kind of softer and less cooked and other parts more cooked, right? Even though we have amazing machines, sometimes they're a little unpredictable. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna just, I don't know if we could like pause my camera over here, Rabbi, but I'm actually gonna take us over so we can start diving into the history a little bit.
Already done.
Thank you.
Just as a reminder to everyone, as you're settling, do you need to take a sip of water or catch your breath? I mean, Sarah, you're there we go. Okay, this is so you can take a sip. In case anyone has still, just so you know about Zoom, you can switch between gallery and speaker, but Sarah's going to be spotlit. And also, I put in the chat the recipe in case anyone had trouble downloading it from Dropbox or downloading it. So if you can, check the chat and you'll see the PDF is right there. And as promised, I'm also going to put in the link to Sarah's cookbook. So I'm going to go ahead and do that as she segues to the teaching. And just going to whisper in case people didn't see it in the chat, I told Alexa to tell us when the time is ready too. So just, she's watching as well. So
cool, amazing. Thank you so much, Rabbi. And thank you for the water break. You're very welcome. Cool. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is actually, I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation. So I'm just going to get that queued up if it will let me. Okay, great. Cool. All right. Great. Okay, so can everybody see my screen okay? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Okay, wonderful. So, okay. So we'd already did our recipe. So now we can really dive into the history and kind of think together, like why is it that I chose that particular recipe, besides it being delicious and a really kind of wonderful canvas that we can flex our Jewish culinary creativity on. So this class, as we have mentioned a couple of times, is dedicated to the Ashkenazi heritage in the Delta. But as I said with the first class, I just want to sort of disclaim that this is by no means exhaustive, and by no means am I trying to make generalizations that only Ashkenazi people lived in the Delta, just like only Sephardic Jews lived in Georgia. That's not the point of this. This is more kind of a line of thought so we can kind of interrogate the many layers of this really complex tapestry of Southern Jewish identity that we're talking about in this class, and specifically Southern Jewish culinary identity, which brings with it just like a little bit different of a lens when it comes to history. So while we are focusing on the Ashkenazi history, it is by no means exhaustive of that history. And to the reverse of that, it is by no means saying that only Ashkenazi Jews exist in the South, and particularly the Delta. Cool. So I just wanted to, I always think it's really helpful to kind of recap before we dive in, especially for the folks who weren't here, for the folks who were here. So we talked about kind of the framing of the class a little bit at the beginning of last session. And two of the questions that I asked you all, and I was just thrilled to see the number of things that you put in the chat. It was so fun for me. And I managed to type a few on our slides, which you see here now is, what is Southern food? Like when we're talking about Southern food, like it means something, like what does it mean? And we got some really cool answers, including, you can kind of see the notes here, consists of a variety of foods that are eaten in Southern states, right? Geography, African origins from various places in the world, right? We're talking about the cultural and the social makeup of the South. We're talking about soul food, huge variety, Creole traditions, all of that stuff. I didn't even capture remotely all of the cool stuff that was said in the chat, but we kind of teased out together, right? Like when we're talking about Southern food, like what do we really mean? Like it's one of those borders that we've put in with our brains as humans on this region, and there must be something kind of shared in that, right? So, what is that thing that's shared? How do we define it? Similarly, we did a same sort of thing with Jewish food, right? Because, right, we're talking about Southern Jewish food. And as we know, Jewish food is a very, very complicated thing, right? We're talking about an entire diaspora when we say Jewish food. But we got a lot of sort of really, I love the answers that came up, and we had a really beautiful, like, reminiscing session in the chat of all of the amazing things that our aunts and our moms and our grandmas have made throughout history. But they include, holidays, right? We have holiday foods, special foods, cholent, chopped liver. There's Ashkenazi influence, right? We had all of these lists of like ribena, schmaltz, kogels, nadelach, chicken soup, Jewish penicillin, right? Like that gives us a little bit of a sense of sort of like the cultural import of our foods. We have Sephardic food, right? And of course, it's not up here, but again, like when we talk about Jewish food, it's something that comes from our diaspora. It's affected by a lot of different things. So just as a recap, that was kind of the starting, these two questions are kind of the starting questions, and there are these really important threads that are woven throughout this series of, teasing that out. So just to give us a little bit of a recap of like what we're talking about. So when I'm kind of thinking about Southern food as someone trained in food history, I think it's really helpful to kind of have bounds that really give us a sense of what we're talking about, that are constructive, that aren't just Southern food is not Northeastern food, right? Because that's not very helpful. That doesn't really give us a sense of the food we're talking about. So a couple of things that I teased out last class that I think are helpful here again, talking about a region, right, which has a certain climate, tends to be warmer. Sometimes it's a little more humid. Also, there's dry heat, right, that allows for certain crops to grow there. There's a history, right, of indigenous people who lived there and cultivated certain things, colonial settlement, which we kind of touched upon last class, slavery, plantation economies, trade, different traders bringing in different foods and foodstuffs into the region of the South, which we'll actually kind of touch upon today as well. And then, right, we have like culture. And so I brought up, right, the South having a different sort of relationship maybe to its food, maybe different than the North. I don't know. That's a question mark. You can tell me if that's right or wrong. Different populations leaving different sort of culinary marks on what we kind of generally talk about as the South. And then for Jewish food, as I kind of mentioned, right, we have a diaspora, historic dispersion of Jews throughout time and place that encompass like a tremendous diversity of climates and locations, but also a real kind of varying of religious observance and how that affects food observance, right? Because kashrut is in some ways this thing that we think, oh, it's this very kind of fixed system what we can eat, what we can't eat, and you know, how to correctly butcher things or not. But actually, depending on the Jewish community that you're talking to, it's very variable, right? It's some of it is the process of interpretation. And so, you know, how do different Jewish communities interpret that? How does our Southern Jewish community interpret that? We also, as Jews, have like an incredible textual tradition that we rely upon, and that has given us kind of the bounds of what we consider Jewish foods, right? Like the 7 species in the Torah for Tu B'Shvat, for example, just kind of thinking off the top of my head. And holiday foods, right? Again, that difference of like, what are we eating on holidays that mark our identity? I think something that comes to mind from always when I talk is matzah, right? Like, who else eats unleavened bread at that time of year, right? Like, that's a very markedly Jewish food. So, you know, even given how we like think about our kashrut, right? Personally, like a lot of Jews eat matzah on Passover, and that's like a really strong connection to that Jewish identity through a culinary marker. And then finally, I think is both a statement and a question at once of like, you know, Jews have settled in all of these different places throughout time and place, and were considered assimilated or not assimilated, a similar ethnicity. They were considered white, not white. And, you know, how does that affect the foods that are entering Jewish homes and being integrated into the Jewish culinary repertoire? And that, I think, is a really important thing when we're talking about, you know, quote unquote, who owns what food. In a way, nobody owns any food, but there are foods that are really strongly shared among cultural and ethnic communities that are deeply tied in different ways at the same time to very strong ideas of identity. So that's just like, I think that's just like a little helpful recap of our frame that we're using to think about Southern Jewish food here. We also talked about specifically Sephardic Jewish traditions in Georgia and this amazing kind of family of the Sheftals, who they themselves were actually German Jews, not Sephardic Jews, but they absorbed a lot of the customs of their Portuguese neighbors with whom they came to Savannah in the 18th century. And we made Perla Sheftal's rice soup. One thing that I thought would also be helpful is to just kind of be a little bit more specific about what are we talking about when we're talking about the South. So I actually borrowed this really helpful map from the Alliance of Southern Jewish Congregations, I believe it is called. And this is sort of the area that I'm talking about when I am denoting Southern. If you disagree with me, I totally respect that. And we can have a chat about what is the South and what isn't the South. But as an academically minded kind of person, I think it's really helpful to kind of make clear the bounds of what I'm talking about, whether or not that's something that is agreed upon. But here, when I'm talking about the South, I'm talking about this region that includes all of these states. And so we are going to really be focusing on this area right here. Really this state, that's the state of Mississippi and the Delta, right? Which is this kind of lovely area. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm trying to indicate it just so you can kind of see. I can even annotate it just to give you.
We can see it.
Okay, great. Cool. Okay, cool. So, right, we talked about Sephardic Jews last class, and we talked specifically about like the colonial influence of these Sephardic Jews, who mostly came from a Portuguese Sephardic community of what is known as the Western Sephardic diaspora from London, right? And they settled in the South, and they brought with them a sort of notion, both externally applied to them and internally upheld as a community, of their kind of prestigiousness as a community. Like the first Jews who came to the United States in general came, even though at the time when they came, they did not have a tremendous amount of material wealth, there was kind of this sense of cultural cultural wealth, of cultural capital, and many of them rose very quickly throughout the social ranks to become upper middle and upper class citizens of colonial Georgia. But I think there's some really interesting tension that starts to come up when we talk now about the Ashkenazi settlement. And we're going to kind of complicate, who are we talking about when we're talking about Ashkenazi Jews here in a second. But really what happens is, kind of as an overview, we have the Sephardic group in colonial Georgia. Shortly thereafter, starting in the late 18th century, you start seeing German Jews arrive, right, who emigrate to the area. Then later on, in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century, of Jews from Eastern Europe. So this might be a very familiar kind of story to folks here. It's a very familiar story to myself, I'm the descendant of some Romanian Jews who came over in the early 20th century. But the thing that I think is really interesting here that I kind of wanted to highlight is that when historians write about the interaction between Sephardic Jews and these new quote unquote newcomers, right, of German Jews and then later Ashkenazi or Eastern European Jews, it's not a very happy relationship. There's because of this cultural kind of weight that the Sephardic Jews felt that they had and often were perceived to have, there was some looking down the nose at the new guys, right? So I just wanted to highlight this quote because I think it's an interesting kind of thing to think about. And I would actually love if somebody would want to read it out loud for everyone. I would love that. I don't know if there are any quick volunteers who really want to read this quote for everyone.
I'll read.
Okay.
Quote or the whole paragraph?
Go from, let's say start with later arrivals.
Later arrivals, both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, fitted in with them in religious practice and social intercourse. This harmony lasted until late in the 19th century, when the well-established Jewish families began to look with scorn and fear at the increasing immigration of German and later of Russian Jews, who were gradually beginning to pose a financial threat and social embarrassment to the genteel and culturally assimilated descendants of the first Jewish settlers, regardless of whether these had actually been Sephardim or Ashkenazim. After the German Jews in America surpassed the Sephardim in commerce, culture, science, and philanthropy, the chief social distinction was between German Jew and Eastern Jew, Ostjuda, with those social distinctions lasting well into the 20th century.
Yeah, thank you so much for reading that. That was beautifully done. I also like hearing other voices in this presentation, so thank you. But yeah, so this quote, what does it bring up? It's from an article by George Fenwick Jones in the Georgia Historical Quarterly called Sephardim and Ashkenazim Jewish Settlers in Colonial Georgia. So if anybody wants that, I'm happy to share that academic article with them. It's been very helpful in my research for this. But there's always this question that has to come up, I think, when we read statements like this, was this really true? Was it really true that there was this kind of tension and scorn between different successive waves of immigrants, right? It's a story we know really well in a variety of communities, but when I look at text, I'm always like, okay, so this is what we're being told. Is this true? So that's kind of a question I want to plant as we talk about this and talk about these different kind of groups of Jews settling in the South, right? Because I'm kind of assuming that this is not only true for Georgia, but it's also true for other areas of Jewish settlement. It's something that's certainly true for Jewish settlement in the Northeast, but I think it's just a really good kind of critical lens to keep with us of okay, so, right, we have this idea that there is tension between Sephardic and German Jews, and then German Jews and Russian/Eastern European Jews, right? So like, how does this play out? Does this play out? And then particularly, like, what does this mean for the food, right? Because we're really here for the food. So I'm gonna kind of take us back, because I think it would be a little bit helpful, because when we talk about Ashkenazi Jews, we're talking about, again, like with the Sephardim, a really complex group of peoples who have come from different times and places and coalesced into what we now have as this category that implies something, right? Some cultural value, some cultural grouping, a communal grouping, a religious grouping, a halachic grouping, right? So like, okay, let's think about that. So when we are talking about Ashkenaz, what are we talking about? A lot of historians believe that the term Ashkenaz, which comes from the Bible, it comes from Genesis 10:3. It was actually the name of one of Noah's descendants. That really, it was taken to apply to this region right here in the Rhine Valley in Germany, right? So we see Mainz and Wiesbaden and Frankfurt. This kind of whole area for many, many centuries, like starting in the late 9th century, was a huge gathering place for Jews, right? And when I say huge gathering place, I'm not talking to the demographic extent that we talk about Jews now, but there was a really significant Jewish community there, especially in Mainz, which like if you're studying a very kind of different history, which we won't cover today, but I will mention it because I think it's interesting. We see a lot of very interesting and very complicated dynamics between the Jewish community there in Mainz and the medieval Christian community that became very important for the setting of certain church policies towards Jews in the medieval period. Okay, but so Germany doesn't really cover what, I consider myself an Ashkenazi Jew. My family's from Romania and Lithuania. Okay, so how did they get in there, right? So there's some very interesting different theories. And there used to be a much stronger sort of denomination between German Jewish heritage and Eastern European Jewish heritage. And that's what we're going to kind of focus on here as well in this time. And I'm actually going to take us back to that first. So how did this kind of come up? Well, I just actually read this very interesting thing that believes that the term Ashkenazi was actually a Turkish term, and it was really supposed to be applied to all of the Jews in Northern and Western Europe along the trade path of the Silk Road, right? The Silk Road was once this really significant trade route that traversed from China, the easternmost coast of China, through the Middle East, up through Poland and like Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, and back down through Germany, through France, into Spain, right? So it's like this very, very long road that connects many, many communities. And traditionally, Jews would settle in the towns closest to that road as traders, as merchants involved in the trade of goods along this really critical commercial artery of ancient, medieval, and honestly modern Europe as well. So some people actually believe that the term Ashkenazi is actually a Europeization of a Turkish word Eskenazi, and that really like the term Ashkenazi applies to this grouping of all of these Jews who lived in various regions beyond Germany, going into Eastern Europe, going into the Caucasus, and that's really where the term comes from. I think that's a really interesting theory, and it helps us kind of explain why when we're talking about Ashkenazi Jews, we're not just talking about Germany, we're talking about Eastern Europe as well. But whatever the case, one of the kind of main things here is like, I think some of the threads we can pull out that are sort of shared, right? Always with the sort of disclaimer that 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 4 synagogues, right? No matter where you go, there's always like a lot of internal kind of differentiation and debate. But some of the really kind of critical cultural markers here that differentiate Ashkenazi from, say, Sephardim, who we talked about in last class. First of all, liturgical and halachic textual interpretation. It took our textual tradition in an applied direction that was different than Sephardic counterparts, right? The caveat here being that those people, those Sephardic counterparts, were also probably like interacting with them. Talking about historical treatment in these different places, in Mainz, for example, in the medieval period, Jews faced a very different set of cultural and historical circumstances than the Sephardic brethren in Spain, where the convivencia occurred. Different cultural development, right? Different traditions, different practices, different expressions, right, of Judaism. And I think that's really important here. And of course, a really kind of key indicator is Yiddish, a linguistic marker, right, that coheres this community. And I think actually for me, the understanding of Yiddish as a marker of being Ashkenazi, of coming from a Yiddish speaking culture, or the kind of geographical marker that Yiddish gives us, is really good. I'm actually going to pause myself here. I'm going to turn my kugel around. I don't know how many minutes it's been. I feel like it's been about 20 minutes. But halfway through, I like to kind of turn my kugel. So I'm just going to do that quickly and I'll be right back.
Sarah, according to Alexa, you have 18 minutes left on the 45-minute timer.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Rebecca.
While Sarah is turning the kugel, that could be a book title. Anybody have any other comments to put in the chat or questions? Heath says it must smell great in your place. So
it does.
We want the smell-o-vision.
Yes, I wish I could have you all in my kitchen. We'll have to arrange that for some future moment so we can make this kugel together. It's also like it will give off liquid. So I was actually noting that like there was some burning smell from some liquid that was coming off my kugel. So I actually put a baking sheet underneath. So if you are having a similar circumstance, I recommend that you do the same. Again, best tools in the kitchen: your nose, your eyes, your mouth, and your hands, right? 5 senses. Oh, and ears too. We love a moment where we can hear what we're cooking too, which didn't happen so much in this class, but is something that I like to bring in as well, because our ears help us a lot. Anyway, so thank you for those questions, Rabbi. Cool. I'm just going to hop us back in here. So right, our geographic marker of Yiddish. So that's how we're kind of generating. But there's a complication here when we talk about Ashkenazim that I brought up a little earlier, between like German Jews, which is also noted in the Fenwick Jones article, or the Fenwick Jones excerpt that we just read together, and Ashkenazim, right? Ostjuden or Ostjude, right? Eastern Jews. There's a difference, and whether that's something that's applied, or really in this case, I think what's implied in that reading, right, is that it's something that's like internally upheld among different Jewish communities, right? Like when we're talking about the Jewish community, we're talking about kind of layers here. We have the overall Jewish community, the umbrella, the big tent, but within that we have like all of these different subgroups, and those subgroups, like many communities do, regulate the belonging, right? Like whether you're in, whether you're out, right? And I think it's, as a historian, it's interesting to interrogate why and how and what differences, who's in, who's out, and why, right? And so I think one of the things that we have to talk about here is German Jews as kind of a self-styled separate group of Jews, for various reasons. One of the main reasons is that German Jews felt and self-styled themselves as, sort of as prestigious, and in some ways the inheritors of the prestige of the Sephardic community historically. And so, and some of this comes out actually in the Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment, happens at the end of the 18th century into the 19th century, which is this just amazing philosophical, intellectual profusion by Jewish thinkers in various fields, including like Moses Mendelssohn is sort of known as the father of the Haskalah. And this event, this Jewish enlightenment, quote unquote, had huge repercussions for like Jewish practice and Jewish philosophy as a whole for the hundreds of years after. We're still kind of dealing with its after effects. Like it's one of the reasons we have the Reform movement, for example. So it's this really important moment of our Jewish intellectual history. And I think it kind of highlights the difference that German Jews felt as a community from their less intellectually engaged Eastern European Jewish brethren and sisters. In part, the Haskalah thinkers were like deeply in conversation with people like Baruch Spinoza, who came from the Amsterdam Jewish community, right? So we have this kind of like intracultural interaction. And so, okay, like economically, intellectually, they're a class of people who are prestigious, and I'm putting that in quotes because, right, like with the Sephardic Jews, were they actually prestigious? In some cases, yeah, they had a lot of material and social and cultural intellectual wealth. In other cases, not so much, right? And especially the folks who decide to leave the country that they're in, not to make a huge generalization, but generally it's the people who are not finding that their life is satisfying where they are, right? Okay, so that kind of, I wanted to just plant those things because I think they're like really important aspects when we're talking now about the Ashkenazi Delta. We're specifically kind of going to focus on a couple of the cities here in Mississippi that you can see on this map. But it's really important because what we see is like when we're talking about Ashkenazi, we're not just talking about Eastern European Jews. We're not talking about a monolithic experience. There's a huge amount of intellectual, economic, social, and cultural diversity just within that grouping, even though there is kind of this geographic, cultural bound in this group of people. And of course, that diversity is reflected in the food as well. So, okay, so that's some important. So I just want to bring us, I want to localize all of us to, okay, we're going to Mississippi. So what happens, who comes and what do they do and why and all of that stuff. So in the first decade of the 19th century is when we really see the first kind of noted documented Jewish presence in Mississippi, specifically in, I might say this wrong, and if anybody's from there, please correct me, Natchez, Mississippi. I've seen Rabbi thoughts, so I know I'm good. Okay, thank you, Rabbi. That's important. We see the first kind of Jewish settlement happening. The first Jewish service happens in Natchez in 1800, right? So we're a little bit farther out from our Sephardic friends in Georgia, like, right? We've kind of traversed the colonial period. The United States is a country that exists. Jews fought in the Revolutionary War. There's already an established Jewish presence in Georgia and other places like Charleston. And it starts to kind of spread out, right? There are trade opportunities in Mississippi. Land is cheap. It's a good place to farm, right? And at the same time, what you have is this influx of German Jews who are escaping some sort of increasingly difficult conditions within Germany at the time, right? Because Germany in its moment is on its imperial journey, and generally the crown is not super friendly to Jews, right? So people are kind of, even with this amazing intellectual profusion, which we often see in times of great like social and cultural upheaval of the Haskalah that's happening in Germany, it's also like a really tough time to be a Jew in Germany. And so we see kind of like a movement of Jews out of that country. And they come to Mississippi because it seems like a good place to settle. It seems like a good place to gain capital. It's not a sizable presence, that I will say, like versus other kind of places where German Jews settle, like New York, which becomes a main place of German Jewish settlement. But it's sizable enough for us, and it's important for us in this talk to talk about like that kind of original settling, right? So then we kind of fast forward, right? And by 1840, we see that we have the establishment of the B'nai Israel congregation in Natchez, and we have Anshe Hesed in Vicksburg in 1841. So these communities are kind of coalescing, synagogues are popping up. There's enough people, enough Jews to kind of create these pockets of community. Okay, so what were they doing? Most of them were peddlers. They tended to be mostly young men. This is the cover of a book that I think is fabulous, and I highly recommend it to anyone who likes Jewish history by Hazia Diner, who's an amazing Jewish historian, about peddling, which is a really quick way to kind of economically gain your footing in a new place where you don't have connections, you just moved there, you need to set up your life, right? So you start peddling. Okay, so that's great. German Jews, they set up through the capital that they kind of gain, especially in Mississippi, they end up setting up dry goods stores. You see like the proliferation of Jewish business owners in second and third generations of these German Jews and later Eastern European Jews who start coming in huge waves, escaping the anti-Semitic violence that's happening as Eastern Europe is going through this incredible like upheaval. They start buying stores, right? Like they have dry goods stores. A lot of them are peddling food related dry goods, like flour. They're also non-food related things like clothing, jewelry, all of that stuff. A lot of the shops that they set up would also kind of have both, right? They'd have your food items that you need, your pantry items, like maybe some barley, some flour, you know, things that you can keep on a shelf, but also you have, like you can buy jewelry, like all of these wonderful things. So we see this growing, modest but growing community of Jews starting to settle. But there's a complication here because most of these people who are coming who are Jews are young men that we have, you know, are well-established Sephardic and German families. But it's a little hard to find a Jewish bride, right? Like it's, there's not the same kind of deeply rooted Jewish community in Mississippi. And so we start to see also like at the same time, a lot of intermarriage. And I highlight this just to kind of prick your ears a little bit to like, okay, what does this mean then for food traditions if this is happening, right? Like start thinking about that. So, great. So this is a photo of B'nai Israel, I think. I've had my note. I lost my note. I'm sorry. Sorry if I'm mislabeling the synagogue. No, this is B'nai Israel, and this is Anshe Hesed. So folks from those communities, hello from your synagogues. So, but look, right, like we've got like a physical Jewish presence, which is something notable, right? It tells us, what does it tell us to the historian's eyes? Like tells us that there are Jews, there's a community, there are people who are rooting there. And that's important because we have this kind of tension that starts to build with these people, these folks who bring with them their Jewish traditions and their certain ways of being Jewish that were kind of what we might now characterize as more Orthodox, right? They're coming from a very Jewish environment to an environment where that's not really so much the case anymore. But that offers kind of like an interesting tension as well, not only in the food realm, but just kind of culturally and identity wise with this real like mark of like, we are here, we have this beautiful synagogue. A lot of the sort of peddlers who kind of by second generation make their ways to dry goods stores start moving up the social ranks in these areas, right? Land is cheap, it's easy to get a foothold. And so Jews and German Jewish and Eastern European Jewish traders who's come to settle in this area of the Delta manage to, within a generation or two, recover wealth very substantially. to the point where they can set up like wonderful social clubs. This is a picture within the B'nai B'rith Literary Association in Vicksburg, Mississippi. I love this photo. You see everybody in their finery, right? Like, and it's a B'nai B'rith building, which I just totally get a kick out of. And you have, like, what is this telling us, this photo? That there's a lot of Jewish people and they want to meet and they want to, you know, court and maybe have Jewish families and all of that stuff, right? So we start seeing, especially at the end of the 19th century, kind of like a modest but vibrant Jewish presence in Mississippi. And so I have some numbers here, actually. So by 1937, there are Jews living in 107 Mississippi towns, right? So which is actually like, it's like an interesting spread. What does this mean? Oh, and another interesting number that I think, right, is maybe a little complicated. These Jews are not only settling, but they really take on their identity, right, in Mississippi. So we have about 200 documented Jews from Mississippi who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, right? So we're seeing like this really kind of interesting negotiation start to happen for this group of Jews, mainly Eastern European, as they start settling here between, you know, being rooted in Mississippi and also trying to kind of maintain a really strong sense of their Jewish identity. Food-wise, what does this mean? Well, it means that at least kashrut, like dietary-wise, it's a little hard to keep, right? There are no kosher butchers despite this presence. But there are ways, right? There are always ways. So, as I said, what about the food? So I really love this quote actually from Marcy Cohen Ferris's book, Matzo Ball Gumbo, which is where the recipe for this class is adapted from. And I'm actually going to ask someone else to read it for me. I'd love to have another voice in here because I think it kind of sums up a little bit the.
I'll read.
Yeah,
I'll be happy to read.
Yeah, please go ahead.
From Matzo Ball Gumbo, Culinary Tales of the Jewish South. Jews bridged the chasm between Delta white and black cultures in their roles as merchants, cotton brokers, and music agents. A compelling source of Jewish identity in the Delta was associated with food served at the dinner table, in the synagogue kitchen, and in Jewish-owned grocery stores and dry goods stores. As Jews encountered their white and black Gentile neighbors, customers, domestic workers, cooks, and caterers, Southern and Jewish foods mixed. At times, food emphasized Jews' Southernness, and at other times, it emphasized their Jewishness.
Right. Thank you so much for reading that. That was beautifully done. Yeah, you're right. We're dealing with a group of people who are coming from a very specific identity of their own in Europe into a totally new region that has a totally different cultural makeup, right? There is like a very notable German presence, which we sort of talked about last class, like the folks from Salzburg who moved looking for religious freedom in the South. Especially during the colonial period. But like at this point, a lot of the people who are coming in, a lot of the Jews, really when they really start arriving is in the late 19th century, is through the, or not the 18th century, I'm sorry. I think I said the 19th century. So throughout the 19th century, but like kind of the demographic majority really starts coming in the late 19th century. And what's happening is post-Civil War, it's a Jim Crow South, right? We have a very kind of complex negotiation here of racial identity as well, right? And we're going to actually talk about that a little bit more next class. But I think it's important because some of the belonging, not only racially, but also, you know, we're talking about people who there are a lot of Jews, but there's not enough to have a kosher butcher, right? It's hard to kind of keep these culinary traditions while in this particular part of the world. But there's this real desire to hold on, at least culturally, to a sense of Jewishness. And how do we do that? We do that through food. Food is a really convenient kind of signifier of that. You don't need a synagogue for that. You don't need hopefully a lot of equipment, right? And you can evoke some of the flavors and the tastes of your homeland and the sense of that are really quote unquote Jewish for you within your kitchen, within your home space. It's not a public space. It's
And speaking of food, it's 45 minutes, so you want to go check the food.
Okay, let's check it out. Let's see how we're doing. Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure. While Sarah's checking, I just want everyone to know that if you missed the beginning or if you missed either session, there will be recordings, and at the end of the program, we will make sure that a link to all 3 recordings will be sent to everyone, but you may not get that until the end of the 3-week session. But if you missed anyone, you'll get it. And if you want to watch it again and again and again, you'll have that opportunity. How does it smell, Sarah?
It smells great. The oven just gave me a little steam bath, so I'm just recovering, but we need a few more minutes. I'm gonna give it like 10 more minutes. How are you doing on time? Okay, so we just have exactly 10 more minutes, which is great because I want to make sure we can I can do the flip for you all and we can unveil how beautiful this is. Okay, so, right, enacting through food. Another thing that I think is important here, right, like starting in the late 19th century, but this is a picture of the old time. Some of you know this. It was a deli established in Mississippi in 1961, but the deli tradition in the South actually proliferates in the late 19th century. We have our first kind of notion of like a deli, actually in New Orleans, another kind of area of the Delta, in 1881, and it sells, all of the dry goods that you would want, but also like sort of appetizing foods, Passover cakes, corned beef, which becomes like a really important marker, a culinary marker of Jewish identity. I think corned beef and pastrami are really cool, and it kind of goes back to that thing I was talking about Ashkenazi identity, maybe connecting to Turkey, because the history of pastrami, for example, is actually a pickled meat that goes back to 11th century Turkey. So maybe there's some like fun connections there. Right. So now we have these, but these delis aren't, like the delis of like New York that are kosher or later on kosher style. These are delis that generally cannot get kosher meat, just by dint of where they are and what's available to them, and a lack of a shohet, who is someone who ritually slaughters meat. But they start opening up, right? So that delis become sort of these interesting ambassadors of specifically of the Ashkenazi Jewish community, serving those like Ashkenazi classics, right? We got pickles, we got corned beef, pastrami, all of those things, not kosher, but not only they're served to Jews, they're also served to non-Jews, and often become really interesting liminal spaces where all of the different kind of cultural groups of the South start to congregate, and they eat, and they're eating a Jewish food, right? Like a food that is strongly related to Jewish identity, even though it's in a lot of cases not kosher, which I think adds like another interesting element here of like, right, when we're talking about Jewish food, is it just kosher? Not always. But I just want to highlight a few tensions here, because there are like a lot of kind of tensions that come out through the food in this experience. Like, first of all, we're seeing religious observance, right? We have like, just by the sheer fact of availability of, how many people are in the minyan? Do we have a minyan in some of these towns? Like, it forces a less kind of strict observance of the dietary laws, right? And different enactments of religious identity generally, but specifically like culinary identity. We also have this kind of strange and complicated navigation of like race, right? Like when Jews first come to the United States, in a lot of ways, they're not fully seen as white, but they're not Black. Where do they exist on the spectrum? Sort of similar to stories of like Irish and Italian immigration. I'm not sure, how many of you have read those histories, but in a similar way to the Anglican white settlers of the United States, those groups weren't quite exactly white, right? And especially given the history of anti-Semitism throughout time, like Jews are this kind of complicated group. Like, what do we do with them? How do we interact with them? And it comes to bear on the actual social dynamics with people, but it also means different groups of people mixing and different culinary traditions coming into contact, right? Also, we have demographics, right? Like, again, some places, a lot of Jews and a deli, a really easy way to culinarily enact your identity. In other places, not so much. It becomes a little harder. You have to make do at home. What do you do? In a lot of cases, people start, making their sort of home foods, right? Like the core foods of like Ashkenazi, Eastern European shtetl life, strudel, blintzes, kreplach, stuffed cabbage, things like that. We have geography, right? Again, that sort of plays into demographics and availability of foods, right? As I was talking about, but I think also like really important here is intra-cultural Jewish differences. Okay, so we have this German Jewish element of the population kind of looking down on their nose at Eastern European Jews. And I think you can kind of see it through the food as well. On the screen right here, this is a picture of what's a Schaumtorte. So that's a meringue. It's like a pavlova. And that, is more roast chicken and Schaumtorte and all of these kind of sort of more rich foods that are like sort of indicate maybe a higher social economic status made more in the German Jewish community. But for Eastern European Jews, and here's a picture of kugel, right? It's the stuff that kind of uses scraps. It's a kitchen that's formed from a lack of things, like cold winters in the shtetl in Eastern Europe. You didn't have a lot of fresh vegetables or fresh fruits. You have things that are pickled, like that corned beef, like that pastrami, things that keep for a long time, things that are stuffed. Again, I think are really important, like stuffed cabbage. You're using every kind of aspect of everything you have. And those things kind of by the demographic majority of the Eastern European Jews who come to settle in America and specifically in Mississippi in the South, that becomes, what we now reference as Jewish food. So, and that is sort of where this recipe for today comes from, of like sort of showing that tension, all of these different kind of tensions among Ashkenazi Jewish identity in the South. And so that's why we have made what we made today. But I do want to just kind of wrap up and say, this is not on my PowerPoint, but one of the kind of interesting caveats here, and maybe as the folks who are living here know, like, starting in the 1950s, we see like a real decline of what was once a very well established Jewish community, right? As Jewish families relocate. And that has a really direct impact on the culinary expression of Jewish identity as well. And I'm going to kind of stop there because that ties into what we're going to talk about next class. But those are just some historical things that I was thinking about as I was preparing this presentation, and just kind of the different layers when we talk about Ashkenazi Jewish identity. We're not just talking about Eastern European identity, we're also talking about German identity. We're talking about the sort of complicated dynamics within the Ashkenazi Jewish subgroup. And returning to that question, right, that comes up from that text of George Fenwick Jones, like, is there kind of an intergroup conflict? Like, I would say that yes, and some of that, though, gets totally overwritten by the culinary predominance of those Eastern European Jews, this Osterjude, right? So it's like a kind of an interesting, quote unquote, just desserts for Southern Ashkenazi Jewish food. So I'm going to leave it there. Next time, we're going to be talking about Jewish soul food. So I hope you will join us. We've got one more minute, so I'm going to actually take our kugel out of the oven, and I want to show it off before you all go. So I will just do that really quickly, and then I will say my thanks and let you have a really wonderful Sunday. But okay, so here, you can still see my hands. Okay.
Do you want us to put the hands up? Let me do that one. Hold on.
Yeah, please.
And Sarah, while you are taking it out, you should know that you're getting some accolades. And also the question was, 2 questions. Can you sub Greek yogurt for sour cream? And does the kugel freeze well?
The kugel freezes like a dream. Kugels always freeze like a dream. They're very reliable. I would just make sure that you eat it before like 3 months of it being in the freezer. Okay. So.
Okay, I'm trying to see your other camera though. Hold on, Sarah. Oh, there it is. Let me spotlight it 1 second. And you know what, Sarah, any chance, well, hopefully everyone, if you're on a computer, you can drag it. Otherwise, Sarah, I'm just going to stop your presentation if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
All right.
There we are. So you can see the kugel hopefully here. And I want to grab us a pan so we can do the big reveal.
Dun, 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 dun.
So yeah. So okay. So the kind of magical thing about this kugel is it's like an upside down cake. We're gonna flip it and hopefully have like a beautiful array of pecans. If you are not me and you're not doing this for a cooking class, I would actually let this sit for about 5 minutes, but I want to make sure you can see the top. So I'm going to do this, but do as I say, not as I do, please. So, okay. And if you're using a round pan, use a round plate. I'm using a baking pan just to make sure it's very hot. So this is a safety move. It's not an aesthetic move. But if you're serving this for people, use a beautiful platter, flip it out. It'll be great. Okay, so I'm just gonna take a knife and I'm just gonna run it around the edge here. My kugel, okay. Gonna put my pan here at the bottom. And I'm doing this carefully, right? Because this is a very hot pan. And always the moment of truth. 1, 2, 3. 1 smooth motion.
Wow.
Oh, we got some peaches stuck on. That's okay. We can just put them back in. That. Yeah, it's satisfying, right? You're like, look at how cute this kugel can be, you know?
We're all giving you rounds of applause. That is gorgeous.
My God, thank you. Yeah, and I just, look, it's all beautiful here. I'll give you a closer view. Hopefully you can see. Just, oops. Just like a little close up of that beautiful kugel. There you are. It's a showstopper. It's good, you know, for all those folks who knock Ashkenazi food, which I do sometimes as well. I will be honest, even though I love it. That's a pretty show-stopping kugel. So